Hello and welcome to this episode of Pause with Nandini on NRI Affairs. I am in Queensland, and here we acknowledge the Yagera and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Mianjin. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge and pay respects to the Adivasis, or the First People, and indigenous communities who are the traditional custodians of the lands, waters, and forests of our country of origin, India. I have a very interesting guest today, and we're going to have a very detailed conversation about all the hats she wears, but primarily something very interesting that she's thrown her hat into. And her name is Indu Balachandran. She is an independent candidate in the upcoming New South Wales local government election as an independent candidate for the Gordon Ward in Sydney's Ku-ring-gai Council. I hope I got that right. Welcome to the show, Indu.
Thank you very much, Nandini. And I'll also acknowledge I'm coming to this interview or this gathering from the lands of the peoples, the traditional owners of the north of Sydney. I'm coming to you from and pay my respects to the Camaragal, Guymaragal, and Jarramaragal people of the Sydney area.
Lovely to have you. I want to read very quickly from your website.
Oh, yes.
Said, I'm standing for council because I believe in the power of my local community and have the will and skill to help strengthen this community. And you say your vision is a culturally vibrant, sustainable community that cares for our built and natural environment. Now, a little bit about the will and skill. I'll demonstrate that by reading a little bit about what your background is. You've got a degree in business and economics, a track record in sustainability, developing nature-based economic models for the Great Barrier Reef, and as board chair at Community Resources, overseeing 700 employees in waste management and recycling nationwide. Advisory board of Western Sydney University's Institute of Culture and Society, and you specialize in property and infrastructure project finance at Lendlease. You also come with 20 years of leadership across housing, family services, and First Nation sectors. Serves as, this is going to take a while, so hang in tight. Director of Strategic Support at the Aboriginal Housing Office for projects exceeding 200 million annually, implemented profitability initiatives and social impact measurements as COO of the National Center of Indigenous Excellence. And I only read these to really demonstrate the depth of experience you have across community and across different sort of job descriptions and work. Your immersion, of course, in the arts and culture, which is how I was introduced to you as an outstanding Veena player. And that is very much a part of your identity. You're a passionate musician, dedicated to fostering art and cultural development. Notable commissions from Belvoir Theatre, ABC, and Sydney Festival. I haven't had a chance to still see you in action, but hopefully it will happen at some point. You're actively engaged in community initiatives such as the Ku-ring-gai Council's Multicultural Advisory Committee, Voices of Bradford, South Asians for Voice, and Behind Closed Doors, which deals with domestic violence. And you have also received an Atlantic Fellowship from Oxford University and are the recipient of the UTS Human Rights Award for Reconciliation.
Goodness.
You need to take a little bit of a breather. Did you even remember all of that about yourself?
It sounds much faster when you're typing it out on bullet points, but thank you for kind of bringing that back.
Indu, I did want to talk to you a little bit about where you come from in India and what sort of, cultural underpinnings that you've sort of grown up with and what your family looks like.
Be happy to. So I was born in Chennai, in Madras, as it was called then, and I moved into an Iyer family, and we moved around India till I was about 11. I come from a very kind of strong family, and for that I'm very thankful. My mother's a musician and a physicist, and my father's an engineer, like many people in our communities. And I've also been given the gift of music. So my grandmother self-taught herself. She taught herself the veena, and then my mum learned it, and I learned the veena from my mum. And my son, I have two boys. They are 17 and 16, and their names are Ramakrishna and Siddhartha. And one of them learns Carnatic music voice, and one that learns veena. So, these are things I think, these are the strings of continuity that we carry with us. I was 11 when I moved to Australia. And I suppose because of my music, but because of, I was fortunate in that you kind of step into community when you come here as a child. So I suppose I have, we have 3 generations now of people in Australia, and my parents are incredibly, they practice, they're active, and they're active in their cultural life. And because of our music, we have, and family, we have connections to India. And I've worked very hard actually to maintain those connections. So, when I finished school, I was 17, I got a scholarship to go to university, and I used to spend most of my spare money traveling to India. I used to go to India twice or thrice a year. And it was because I think it was because I hadn't yet formed belonging to this place. I didn't feel entirely comfortable here. And it was so much fun and it kind of nourishing to go back to a place that felt familiar, where people looked and felt like me. And, but from that also, I think, came this ability to connect to my homeland independently of my family and create my own story to pass on to my children so that they might create their own. I think it's really important. So I go back very often. The children go back very often. My parents are here, and I've married a Tamil man. So we have an enormous extended family and community in Sydney. I have 14 nephews and nieces. And so I feel like, in many ways, we've landed with the best of all worlds. And you have to, and it required work. I mean, I think this doesn't happen by accident. I always say to my children, whatever what happens to you in the future is not an accident, right? You have to have intent. And sometimes those intents require different kinds of work. And sometimes they require kind of relinquishing. Sometimes but it has to be intentional. And I think, yeah, so that's probably been my connection. And because of the children have had this incredibly expansive upbringing, they have a huge family around them. They've been cared for by many people. They have a sense of what love looks like that isn't just their parents. And it looks very different, because we have aunts and uncles who are very different from us. And the rule in our house is, whoever you go and stay with, their rules count, because they love you, might not look like us. Their rules might not look like ours, but you have to navigate that, and it comes from their love. So, we don't want to really interfere. And and I think the children have really benefited from that. So I think, I'm lucky we have language. I speak Hindi and Tamil, and I've tried to maintain that. The boys, they hopefully they will also be at least bilingual, if not trilingual, but they have an interest in that. So, yeah, I think that kind of that connection, and also being able to make sense of who I am without it just being of the past, I think is really important. What is it to be Indian in Australia? What it is to be Tamil in Australia? What is it to be Iyer in Australia? What are all those meanings? They are active, and it requires evolution and relinquishing. And again, I think it can't be accidental, but I love it. I'm really pleased. That itself is a privilege, isn't it? And I'm so happy that that it's a place that I can occupy.
Absolutely. Love it. Love the fact that, you also have maybe an empathy then for, new migrants who've just come, because you've had that experience as a child when you come into a culture that's so different from yours. And at the same time, because you've lived here long enough, you do understand the prerogatives of people who do call Australia home, no matter where they're from. So I think that's, if anything, I think it only gives you a more sort of enriched way of looking at your Australian experience. And it was really lovely to hear about your family. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Nandini.
I know since I've moved here, I've been in touch with many volunteer and community organizations, and they all essentially are seeking a seat at the table, right? In different ways for the different prerogatives that they bring. And thinking about empowered representation, which is something that I've been thinking about quite deeply lately, I feel like for you to jump into politics in this way and actually stand as an independent, there's a story there, and it's also, it seems like sort of a natural progression for someone who wants to make a deep impact. So I'd love to know what your reasons were to take this on.
Thank you. Yes, it was a very slow, I suppose, development. And it wasn't, I don't think, ever intended to land in politics. But I think over the years, I started my career in project finance in the commercial sector for a property company, as my little bio read. And over the years, I think I've just become more and more engaged with, attracted to, and I think I have been able to see myself as generating some value to the social purpose sector. And it's called community development, I suppose, in Australia. I think for me, there are probably a couple of moments that made me think, oh, where now and why now? I'll start with the latest first. My last role was with the Aboriginal Housing Office. It was a director's position. It was a great job, and I was doing really interesting work in the state government, supporting the delivery of housing. And when I finished there, I was had just finished the fellowship, and the fellowship was quite a demanding program. It really kind of demanded that the fellows look within ourselves and look at ourselves and look at our whole relationship to place and people, because it was Indigenous led, and it was very much that kind of Indigenous lens. And I think for me, the kind of takeaway from that program was I wanted to stop with institutional work for a period of time, because it's all encompassing and all consuming. And if you're busy, particularly if you have a busy senior job, it really does take over. And also if you work in the social purpose sector, there's this kind of additional richness, I think, which is even harder to restrain. So when I finished there, I thought I'm going to just have a little rest and think about what next. And the other thing I really kind of examined in the fellowship was civic spaces. I was really interested in, and it was a social change program, and I was interested in, beyond institutions, because that's all I had done. Although I'd worked in kind of community organizations and volunteered and supported a lot of services that work much more deeply in the civic space, I was really interested in how one navigates individually in the civic space and not with a role or a title. So I spent some time after I finished just involving myself in things I cared about. And by chance, I was shepherded into a program called Pathways to Politics, and it wasn't something I had ever intended, but I thought, this is the whole point of an exploratory phase in life, is to explore. So, and when I finished it, it was an extraordinary program, because it's convened by a philanthropist who supports women, particularly as a pipeline into politics. And my insight after I finished that program was there was an extraordinary momentum of women who came from all walks of life and all backgrounds and all political parties and political persuasions, who had committed to changing how politics was done. And to me, that was a really powerful imperative, because, politics to me is not a form of heroism. It's a political move. It's a movement. And I thought, here's a place I suppose, for me, that was bigger than myself and was growing in momentum, and also had the values that I really cared for. And so when I finished it, I thought, okay, well, when you do these things, you can either wait for the right time or you enact what you have seen and learned. And it seemed to me that I've always been very, very attached and connected to the importance of local community. So I think it really matters. It matters what street you live on, who your neighbors are, which streets your children walk through, how you interact with people in the local town center, who those people are, where they live, where they've come from. Because I think all that is a foundation for who you become in the wider world, or should be anyway, or can be. And so I decided I would stand for council, and it felt very comfortable. I mean, after I making the decision was hard, because I think one doesn't want to be seen as a politician because what you see and hear about politicians and what people feel about politicians is not always a positive thing. And so, I think to make the leap in myself, that I wasn't seeking to be a politician as a career, but it just seemed like a good space for me to inhabit, because I had the will and I had the skill, and I think I had the kind of resilience. I've lived in Australia for 35 years. I feel like I know this place and I belong here. It took a while to come to that point. And so, when you belong, I think you have to enact what matters to you. I don't think of belonging as a passive thing. It's an active thing. And so, it seemed to me. And my local community, Ku-ring-gai Council, is a really interesting one. I think it's going through a lot of change. It's changing in demography, it's changing in political persuasion, it's changing in how we see ourselves, how we want to see ourselves. So that's a space I feel comfortable in, and I feel comfortable to navigate, and I think being a little sure of who you are and where you fit helps a lot when you're trying to represent a community that is very, very, very broad. And so, in terms of your question about empowered representation, I think that is, to me, it's a great point of reflection, because for me, representation, when I look at my council, is who represents all of us. Why are they seen as, or we seen as, appropriate? How do they represent those that are not like them? And the same applies to me. How do I represent people whom I have affinity to because of various connectivities, but also how do I represent the whole? And that has been a really wonderful journey. And I think speaking to people in the community, in my community, for months, has been really important to that, because the way we connect with different people is different, but I think it's really important to establish with the community that you have different ways of connecting with them, and therefore we are all of the same community and we all belong together, and that where you're born, what language you speak, what you look like, that diversity is actually your sexuality, how you feel about politics, whether you want more housing or less, whether you care about trees or not. All that is simply part of good community. And if we can all get better at thinking about what we want shared community to feel like, which is a discipline, and I don't think it's a discipline that is particularly practiced in the world, I think we could build very strong communities. So, I think I come from a place of belonging. I come from a place of shared community. I think it's really important to come from that if you want to celebrate and make change. I don't think you can make change from the outside, and I don't think that's appropriate. So I think the question is, how are we all part of the inside, and where does change and joy come from in that position?
Wonderful. Such an answer that that makes you reflect on so many of the things you spoke of. One of the things you did touch upon is this idea of that everybody's inside, and the fact that, now we're also rethinking how we even think about marginalized. I mean, who decides who lives on the margins and who lives on the center? Right. So I wanted to ask you about your focus areas where you've said sustainable development, strengthening community through culture, and accelerating solar power and waste reduction. And I thought maybe we can speak about each of these a little bit. So, about sustainable development, as I was thinking about that, and there's so much talk now about systemic change, and the old structures are no longer serving us, and in a capitalistic system, right, where even politics seems to be subsumed by the financial systems, what are some of the local mechanisms that you have found useful in pursuing sustainable development? And the other question, I suppose, that's related to this is, how do you make big business care enough, for it to be something that actually can be a solution that benefits all? Because the moment you come up against business and it becomes sort of a binary that you either have sustainable development or you have, financial growth and all of that, how do you navigate that? And it's a good question, I think, for you, because you come from that world. So
Yeah.
you can straddle a few different perspectives.
Yes, and then you kind of framed it really interestingly. So the idea is what are the local mechanisms was your first element, and it's a really interesting. The interesting thing about sustainable development housing, particularly, which is the framing of that first pillar that I had in my campaign or have in my campaign. So the thing is, local government has remarkably significant power in deciding housing design and who, development mechanisms and development framing and boundaries and guidelines. So in some ways, I'm remarkably pleased with the possibility that if I win and when I'm in council, one of the big contentions in this area is housing. So there's this kind of fear, not even fear and resistance to increasing housing in the area because it might reduce certain elements that the community cares a lot about: heritage and trees and green space and so on and so forth. So I think that the real friction in this is actually not about local power. It's actually about local vision. So I think the opportunity for us as a community at this point in time is to actually understand and enact our agency. So, this is one of the few areas where council has the power to develop a housing plan and a housing strategy. And that housing strategy has to be founded on the vision and engagement with its community. So, and that is the housing strategy that it uses to then negotiate with state government on where things are built, and also the strategy that accommodates targets that are set for our council area. So it's actually, in theory, a remarkably engaged mechanism, not in practice. So, I think from that kind of local mechanisms, when it comes to housing, I think of housing as community design. What houses you have, what diversity of stock, what they look like, what they feel like, who can afford it, what kinds of amenities you have that attracts what kinds of people, what ages, what backgrounds. That is your community. And most people move to a place for a combination of factors, and housing and usually, some kind of local amenity, whether it's school or work, they're the two main pillars. So I actually think the idea of council having power over developing housing planning is the most powerful form of community design. And I don't think we think of it like that. And I think my own community is has been used to just saying no, and it could look terrible, and actually all we see are examples of bad and ugly and things not working. So my view is, how do we build, and how can we build a really formidable vision around what good looks like, and what good looks like in Ku-ring-gai? So, every community has its own quirks and characters, things it cares about, things it was, things it is, things it wants to be. And I think there's a really powerful opportunity for us to use the housing strategy as a mechanism to coalesce. I think it will be a challenge. It's not easy because I think most people are not used to coalescing around things like housing. But I think there are good mechanisms for bringing communities together to make sense of disparate voices. And so that's, I think that kind of local mechanism is really exciting in terms of housing. Now, in practical implementation is usually where the challenges lie. So I suppose you can ask me in 2 years and we can talk about how successful visioning was. But it's something I'm looking forward to. And I think it's something that is that makes people feel hope, and makes people feel engaged instead of feeling embattled and feeling put upon. So that's probably kind of my response to your first element, big business and how to bring them in. So, I suppose when I said development, I mean it very much in the local context. What does space and precinct and place look and feel like? So I suppose I'm just trying to think about the role of developers in this local context is very much enabled only by what council and state government allows. So they are really it's a regulated process. But I think the essence of your question is really is bigger than that.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about, there's been so much talk lately about the monopoly or duopolies of, say, supermarkets.
Yes.
Right? And then local communities that want to support local businesses. And how do structurally we support that? While, of course, big business, it's a foundational part of a country's success as well.
Yes.
And generates employment, and it's got its own momentum in its own space. So I was thinking more of the interconnectedness of those two things, where we also want Woolies close at hand, but we also want to support local business and buy local. And sometimes I think just in very tactical ways with our choices, we kind of demonstrate our politics in that way.
Yes, that's a lovely way to put it. Our tactics demonstrate our politics. I think perhaps the analogy or the image to use is the idea of the local village. And again, I think there are some great examples of villages in Australia. And it has a very different meaning to villages in India. But I'm talking about that town center, that hub, that gathering place that is not home and not work, that brings people together. Someone here in one of my conversations calls them third spaces. And I think they are really important, and they are designed and they have to be intentional. And those third spaces, they are also a dynamic between the community and between small and big business, right? Communities can decide, and often in local areas, there's a kind of resistance to the big Woolworths and Aldis. And so then you might end up with a Woolworths Metro because it feels more in keeping with the village feel. But I actually think those are the healthy tensions that create villages where there's economics that is there is an economy that it doesn't feel sterile and removed of the kind of the quirks of human beings and communities and people. So I think local communities are actually probably a great crucible for these dynamics to come to play, and how communities are empowered to actually ask for what they want in these villages. Oh, we want more food choices. We want food choices that represent our communities. We want a small, large supermarket, or actually, you know what? We don't have a large supermarket within 15 kilometers. Can we please just have a large supermarket? Because, sometimes at 10 o'clock, I need formula. So I think, but I think people have to feel, communities have to feel like they can have a say. And that is, all the systems of government work well. And on the other hand, it's also large companies increasingly, I think, being held to account for their social license to operate. And that comes partly from regulation, and it comes partly from people, from society. So I think that is the power. And Australia is I think we're very lucky to live in a country where, these mechanisms work reasonably well for most people, not for everyone. Let's be really clear. Going back to the question of margins, there are people who are structurally disadvantaged for reasons of history, for reasons of economy, for reasons of, I don't know, religion, race. It could be anything.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's really a good point, that this tension is healthy, and this tension between sort of different perspectives is what keeps things dynamic, rather than perhaps what's the alternative, a top-down dictatorial sort of, and that comes with its own challenges. So this kind of place, as long as again it goes back to people having the power of their voice and having representatives who actually are more inclusive and can actually bring forth all of those diverse voices and form something that is. I want to talk a little bit about strengthening community through culture, right?
Yes.
And it's no secret that, recent world events, whether it's Israel and Gaza, whether it's what's happened in India with elections, or what's happened very currently in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, in the UK, Canada. So we're seeing a churn, right? We're seeing a churn. And when we see political churn, I think we also see some of it manifest in culture and
Yes.
in community, and fissures and binaries are drawn very strongly between right and left, and those kind of divisions do come to the fore when there is political turmoil. So I want to ask you that what role then can culture play in building social cohesion, and what commonalities can we sort of draw upon when politically there is so much divergence to still continue to function like a whole? We need to.
It's a really good question, and in some ways, it is. It kind of gives light to the second pillar, which is about my vision is to emphasize the value of arts and culture in connectedness. Now, one of the problems in Ku-ring-gai is it's actually a remarkably well-read. The North Shore of Sydney is they love their cultural activities and they love the arts, but our area is really, really lacking in arts and cultural facilities. And it's quite remarkable. And I think part of this is the kind of financialization of life. Where is the best use value for money, and where is the best return? And returns are always measured in financial returns. And so the ability of society, and maybe decision makers, not society, I think most people understand who love the arts and who go and watch something or read something, understand the power of it. But I think decision makers sometimes are not able to demonstrate the value to society and to cohesion. And I hope that, my voice and my experience can bring that in to council decisions. And, part of the kind of change in my community is the demographics. We are actually more culturally diverse than the Greater Sydney on average. But the perception of this area is that it's not.
Mm.
A larger proportion of us are born overseas than Greater Sydney. And, the kind of biggest growth in migrants is Chinese, Indian, Korean, Iranian. So it's a very interesting new mix. And, we have to have ways of, so the kind of what the street and community looks like now isn't what it looked like 20 years ago. And as a community, we have to build practice around connecting differently with people to what it might have looked and felt like 20 years ago. It might, involve different food. It might involve different activity. It might involve different times of day. It might involve, different invitation types, because who they are, what they bring into this community, what they enact is unique to them. And I think gathering places, if we go back to the idea of the third spaces, that is that which is not home or work. One of the most fundamentally important gathering places that enables cohesion is the world of arts, because it enables people to share who they are, and it enables others to see, right? So it's about, I see you, I see everything that you are, all that you bring, all of your past, because, we don't become divorced from our histories. We don't become divorced from what we carry. We don't become divorced from our cultural heritage, our languages, whatever it is, right? Our traumas. And so I think those spaces of arts and culture are tremendously important, because they're not places of reports. They're not places of words. They're often not places even of languages, music and film and the moving picture. These are ways of seeing that are far more sophisticated than, words and speaking to each other possibly only in English. So I think that is something that I believe will truly enable. And I suppose in some ways it's a remembering, because I think this community has a history of really strong artistic and cultural life, and it's just been denuded and neglected over a period of time. And so I feel like, particularly in the face of changing communities, those spaces and the discipline of restraint and surrender, I think, when you're in the arts space, is really, really important for communities in these moments. Because, sometimes in all the examples you've given, you might never agree. You might never agree. But I think the discipline to say, I see you and I see who you are, and I'm not sure I agree or wholly understand, is something we need to get better at doing.
Yes, of course. I mean, learning how to disagree better, and this sort of cultural exposure therapy, if you will, you can't really demonize or other someone like your neighbor, like someone you share the street with, you clear your bins together, that kind of integration. And if you're able to have that kind of storytelling through the arts, which isn't only words, which is through art and through music. Specifically, I think music is something that's so universal because it appeals to something so much more primal, right? So much more ancient, I think, before language. That's really a great opportunity. And I can't think of anyone better to push that agenda than you, since you're.
If I might, I'll give you a really interesting example. I went to a sing-along of a theatre that's been shut for 10 years, and there's a community group that's trying to bring it back. And they did a little sing-along in a little community hall. And, there were 40 or maybe more, maybe 100 of us from the community. And so one is the power of arts to see, but the other is the power of arts to just create so much joy. It's so much fun to sing. I don't know, John Bon Jovi and the Beatles and, Christmas carols, who cares? But it is a really, and I think we're forgetting how to in the memory of those spaces of folk music, where people just, you don't have to, it's not about stage and audience. It's just the singing in
Unity.
homes and singing in community halls and listening, watching films in amphitheaters, and that experience, I think, is important to keep in cultural memory and to keep making those memories.
Yes, I love that. And when you see, I think in this aspect, we can really learn from children
Yes.
because how quickly they will pick up a song in another language and sing it, as if they own that language, and it's so easy for them to straddle words. And as we grow up, unfortunately, we lose that ability, I think, that fluidity to be quite across culture in a very easy, organic way. Oh, because my friend's from Korea, so I now know a Korean song. you know so
Yes.
that's just something really wonderful. I do want to talk about your last pillar, just
Yes.
going across those three things, although I could spend all day talking about the arts and culture.
True. So could I.
Let's talk about the accelerating solar power and waste reduction. I know that in your introduction you do have a background in that space, you worked in that space. What is it specifically, and what tangible initiatives and outcomes are you looking at for your community in that space?
Look, those two particular specifics came from a broader um, interest in and commitment to a care for our place and planet, and just the science that unless we start to really recognize um, where we are going, and the kind of the unpleasant unknown that we are heading towards, and also in some ways the climate uh, the climate science actually, to me, is a way of simply proving just how incredibly connected we are around the world. No longer do national boundaries matter because currents and pollution and air and water and fire and smoke travel.
Fast.
Mercury, mercury in seas doesn't stop at the edge of a national boundary, So to me, that is a real, maybe it needed to come to this for all of us to recognize just how connected we are. But the problem is, at a very local level, it's very difficult for people to understand what enacting an action looks like. So it's been really interesting. Ku-ring-gai has actually a really excellent sustainability plan and program. We have a net zero plan. We've got great community champions. But as I've been knocking on people's doors and talking to them, overwhelmingly, more than any of the other issues, people are like, we need to do something. But actually, I don't know what that looks like at a local level. And I'm not sure what difference it will make. So tell me, what is the highest yield kind of action, and show me how to do it, and I'm onto it.
Yes.
But it's so interesting how much they want to do something and how unsure they are. We are, and this is I mean, it's a professional majority. People here are engaged with the environment.
Mhm.
People here are engaged with climate science and just general knowledge. It's an interesting electorate, Bradfield. It had the largest shift in the federal election in the country towards the independent candidate. It
Really?
was community independent with climate, gender, and integrity were her foundational factors, and she had a huge swing. She didn't win, but it shows to me it was about the community expressing its sentiment through the vote. The second example of your tactics and political intent is we were the only electorate in the whole country, liberally held at the federal level, that voted yes in the referendum. So it's I think this community doesn't want to be boxed. It has a history of, I think, being boxed and being taken for granted. And neither are those sentiments the same, nor are the people the same. It's a shifting community. So I think, there's this real desire. And so, you just have to light, the spark is there. So how do you light the fire for not a fire, but how do you kind of spark this and give direction to this energy that exists? I think solar and waste are just really, they are what local council can actually support. And so it's about how can we make these things tangible, but also effective?
Yes, I think, I like the fact that, you recognize that this is not an easy, glib answer. There is no easy answer. A lot of people now also say, like, here I am recycling my seventh plastic bag while millionaires are flying across to attend climate conferences, right? Like, the vast difference between how the 1% are consuming and living, and what the enormous responsibility that then we foster on ourselves, saying, look, we all must do something. Whereas we're so far removed from the bigger decisions that actually impact climate in really big ways. And again, you said even those decisions go beyond geographical boundary, go beyond national boundaries, because sometimes business supersedes those as well. So therefore, like for instance, in Bangladesh's case now, they're talking about many of the things that were signed away that were not beneficial to Bangladesh that now are going to be relooked at. So it's how the political and the environmental concerns can actually keep people and community center. It's a difficult question, and there aren't easy answers. I do want to talk a little bit because we are NRI Affairs and we do cater to the Indian diaspora and the South Asian diaspora. And you will recognize that you and I both probably come from enormous privilege, where, the privilege of education and social standing and even caste privileges that are generational. And there has been some talk now in Australia about recognizing that level of privilege and the gradations within an Indian community based on these kind of privileges that we come from and that we come with. How do you see that impacting the the involvement of the Indian diaspora in political life? Do you think that it's a certain section of the Indian diaspora that are politically engaged or that can afford to be? And what are some of the ways in which we can strengthen that?
It's a really interesting question. I think that it does help, because I've worked in the arts and in the First Nations, with First Nations people. I think you build a reasonably good lens for understanding positionality, your position to your current place, what positions you brought from your past that give you certain benefit, but also, what histories you bring that other you in these communities. So I think that kind of understanding and awareness is very, very helpful. And I think having a breadth of experience and, I suppose, engaging in many ways in society helps with that. In terms of, and who, even within the Indian community, who gets to be the representative. And I have a very good friend, Shankari Chandran, who's an extraordinary writer. She won the Miles Franklin Award. We talk about this. She's a neighbor of mine. She's actually on my campaign team. And we talk about the enormous privilege we have and the roles we play because we are able to occupy comfortably certain bridges within our communities, within and because, I think because some of us more actively engage in who we are in our own communities, and the bridges, we can occupy, and in a different, along that spectrum in different places, how we engage with newer migrants, our connection to older migrants, the privilege that comes with being more established in these communities, the kind of cultural vibrancy that comes with being newer to this country. I think but there are certain, because of certain, where we are in this moment and what linguistic, educational, family networks, international, cosmopolitan communities that we have access to, it gives us basically a pass to sit on more bridges. Now, the question is, if you're aware you're occupying the bridge, then you can state, is it appropriate? And where do I need to be further along on the bridge to make a difference to my community, and where do I need to come off the bridge because other people need to be on that bridge. So I think that is very much what I'm aware of, and I recognize, I suppose in my own community where I am, it's reasonably established, it's affluent. Most of the migrants traditionally who move here who have lived here for a long time because you can't afford to live here otherwise. It's changing now because newer migrants are better off than the old days, so they can move straight here. And the type of migration is changing. And I think that is who we are in Australia. And so how do we reckon with that? But, I do recognize that the bridges I can sit in my own community and feel like I'm on the inside, going back to our original question. I recognize that, and I value that. But I'm also conscious that that bridge is not available to others. Or, they don't have the confidence, or they don't feel like they belong. And my view is, I'm really committed when I get in to council, I've been told by my team, I must say, when I get in, one of the things I really want to do is build some kind of program, and it doesn't have to be anything formal, so that in 4 years, when the next council elections roll up, I have been able to help, a number of people from different communities and backgrounds actually think that it's possible for them. And I think that is really important, because I do think our representation lags significantly behind who our community actually is. And that is actually not good enough. And for me now, being on that bridge, I'm not attached. If I have a term, and if there's 10 people who are possibly better for the community than me, and have more will and more skill, off you go. This is not some kind of lifelong career. This is really about my being able to give to my community and learn through this process, because I think I will develop a whole lot of skill and learning. So I recognize I will be taking from this position of public service as much as I give to it. So I hope I can be a bridge for others, because I recognize my accent, my education, my ability to traverse comfortably in different circles. These are assets that not everybody has.
What I find quite inspiring is that, yes, you do have all of these assets, but the thing is, you're willing to lean in, and you're willing to lean into a space that isn't necessarily, comfortable, where there are no easy outcomes that you can sort of, already start thinking about that will work. It's going to be a difficult process, and you're willing to put, yourself into it. And I think that itself, it's one of those show not tell. So for people from the community, when they're looking at you taking this step, I think that itself
Yes.
is something that's remarkable, to think that, well, maybe there is a way. There is someone, who looks like me, perhaps, who comes from the same cultural background, perhaps with a different set of experiences and attributes and skills, but it seems within reach. That
Yes.
bridge seems within reach. So I
And
think,
it gives hope. It gives hope, Nandini.
yes,
I think I mean, it's really unfair people feel like this, but I remember I was speaking somewhere a few years ago, and this older South Asian man, I think he might have been Indian, he came up to me at the end and he was weeping. He was actually everyone had left, and he was shedding tears. He says, I'm so proud to see you up there speaking and being who you are. And I got the sense that in some ways it was a proxy for him. And, you know, it's terrible. It's terrible that people feel like it was something that they was beyond their reach, but somehow this kind of, there's hope.
Yes.
So it was quite bittersweet, actually. I was so pleased that he came and said that, and so pleased he felt comfortable to come and say that and have a chat with me. But I also recognize that, you know, people need to be able to touch and feel, but not only that, once they've done it, they need to be invited in.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think this is one really big step for the community to see more people, from the community representing, taking those chances and going in there. Finally, I did want to talk a little bit about women
Yes.
from the diaspora. I know you work perhaps in an advisory capacity. I'm not sure in how much depth you work with family violence and all of that, but there has been a lot of talk lately about the position of women in Indian societies in Australia. In fact, some councils have talked about including dowry as coercion, as one of coercive violence, I think, or one of those spaces. There is talk about women who come on dependent visas, not really having agency over their own lives. And of course, there is the actual violence as well that we're seeing so many cases of. In this space, as you're a woman leader and you've got visibility of the community, what would you say are certain, perhaps, things that the community needs to actually look within in solving these problems? Because not all solutions will come from the outside. I think we have to be able to take that, hard look within. And what are some of the learnings that you've had, and what are your thoughts?
Oh, that's such a complex question. I'm not sure how I'm going to answer that kind of in a succinct way. I think, you know, I suppose because I've worked in community services for a while, and some of them have definitely touched on women's support and domestic violence and refuges and so on. Some of the work I did in the last few years has been around the arts, and I suppose using the arts to re-express experiences of domestic and family life in this context. So, we recognize, again, there's so much cultural, historical context, and not all of it is about the patriarchy. There's also kind of familial, social things that give power that no longer exist here when you've moved to a different country. But there's also the patriarchy that you carry with you. I think, and that was a really interesting program of work, because it was about telling the story of experience of domestic and family violence into our community, by our community, using our own modes of music and art and spoken word and so on, and as a catalyst for reflection. So, it not so much accessing services and navigating the system, which is what most of the mainstream does, is like, how do we provide access, but actually sometimes those systems cannot help. So really our community has to understand that and then enact. It's a kind of conscientization. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Who is going through it? And
Yeah.
what is an appropriate response? And no, it's never going to be neat. And no, I'm never going to have all the answers, but it's okay. And I mean, there's a way we have to take responsibility for our own people. And in some ways, the whole community is our community, but because we have a more nuanced understanding of possibly women that come from backgrounds like ours, we have a particular responsibility, I think, to respond in a different way. So I think it is interesting conscientizing the the South Asian community in that space. And I actually think because they are in this context and the kind of women's movement, the articulation of empowerment and agency here can be quite a positive thing. I mean, I think some of the things it doesn't hold are the kind of communal networks women feel, and how do you transplant those? But I think there's a real opportunity to attend to issues of domestic and family violence, gender-based violence here, by our community, for our community. So one of the things I'm doing, and I don't know how long it'll take, but it's a kind of a pet project of a group of us, and we're calling ourselves the Aunties Fund. And we want to effectively become a vehicle, or create a vehicle, not become one, create a vehicle where community giving and engagement meet. So how can we have tens of thousands of South Asian people giving $5 each a year? That will support grassroots services that really understand the kinds of interventions women in our community need, which might not look like a refuge, may look like a refuge, may look like many other things, but also how to bring people in. So it's not just the money, it's actually you are part of that story, you are part of the solution, and your own consciousness and engagement with and sophisticated understanding and courage to actually see it is really critical to the solution. So that is the kind of pipe dream that a few of us are building. And it's not about philanthropy, because that is not something that is going to solve the issue. I mean, money certainly helps.
Yes, you can't just throw money at this. Yeah.
It needs mass movement and a rejection of certain forms of control and what is seen as ordinary. It has to stop, and it has to come from us, and it has to come from a nuanced understanding and absolute engagement with how to see and respond.
No, that's great. I love the initiative. When you're ready, we'd love to support you at NRI Affairs with that. I think it's great to get more community involved. What is it? The Auntie Network?
But we're calling the Aunties Fund.
Aunties Fund, right. I like the
Make
name.
them laugh.
We'll pull in a few uncles as well.
Yeah, well, but it's going to always be led by the aunties. The uncles can be our supporters.
Yes, why not? And finally, I do want to wrap up with any advice or any pointers for people who do want to enter politics, young people especially from the community. What is a pathway that you might recommend as perhaps one of the ways to consider?
Yes, I mean, I would not be a veteran in political pathways. I've come into it in my late 40s, and I'm not sure if it is a political pathway, but it is officially that. I would say join a campaign. Just join your local campaign, whatever party you care about, whatever movement you care about. You know, if it's the Greens, the Labours, the Liberal, Independent, whatever it is, join a campaign. It is a great way to understand how politics works, and campaigns are really inclusive. I mean, anyone who's interested is welcome. So join that. I mean, in my campaign, it's fascinating. I have one of my old music students, she's now in year 7, is absolutely dedicated to attending every event, because I think for the first time she's saying, oh, perhaps I could do this. And I said, yeah, sure you can. It's she's a very quiet and clever girl. And I think for a lot of people, I'm the first person they actually physically know. But you don't need to, I mean, join my campaign, but join anyone's campaign in your local community. And they would love to have, young, interested people, and be seen. Don't just go along and be quiet. Like, be seen and be heard, because you have something to offer. Because the whole point of politics is it's meant to represent all citizens, and you are one of them. So just join someone and kind of use your voice, and the rest will come through.
I think that's great advice, and I think it's something that anyone can really get involved in without too much, thought. If they really want to be involved in the political system, just join a campaign. And all the best for yours. When is it? Is it the 14th of September? All right. So 14th of September, we hope that you do make it to council, and all these wonderful things that you've got in your mind and in your experience, and the community that possibly is really ready for this kind of change. I hope it all comes through and works out. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nandini. It's been such a treat.